Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Horus Heresy lore breakdown. Today we've got another compilation story, The Mark of Calth. This one is actually really damn good. The compilation stories often vary a great deal in my opinion because they lack that overarching thread that many of the other stories have. But in this case, it is simply a series of short stories that are happening after, and some even before, the Battle for Calth. Which gives us Battle for Calth. This gives us a lot more of an insight into the war, its aftermath, and how it was planned for, with one in particular being very interesting, featuring a word bearer infested by a demonic entity. Or is he? That one's one of my personal favorites because it gives you a really interesting look into how the Neverborn, the demons, interacted with the word bearers. But before we get into it, to rip off the ever-excellent Countdown Killer, it is your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. Now normally, I wouldn't want to run two sponsorships from the same source back to back like this, and it's not really a different sponsorship either, but the lads over at Raid were so impressed by the last video and how many people signed up for it that they asked me if I would be so kind as to extend it for one more video. And since they didn't even ask me to make a special plug or anything, I figured, what's the harm? Let's put it down in the description down below. And so, if you want to try out Raid Shadow Legends, or if you simply just want to support the channel, then please do head down there, click the link, finish the tutorial, and thank you all very much for your attention and your patience. Now, onto the video. The first story is The Shards of Erebus by Guy Haley. As the title quite clearly suggests, this is indeed a tale of the first apostle, Erebus. I am growing more fond of the little bastard, I must say, because, well, his plans are becoming a little bit more complex and proper, and he needs to actually work for them, which I really do like. Even if a dude is an absolute evil shit, as long as he actually has to put in some effort to achieve these plans, well, that immediately makes him somewhat more interesting. Though Erebus is also, well, he's getting a little bit overly motivated, perhaps. But before we get into it, to rip off the ever-excellent Countdown Killer, it is your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. Now normally, I wouldn't want to run two sponsorships from the same source back to back like this, and it's not really a different sponsorship either, but the lads over at Raid were so impressed by the last video and how many people signed up for it that they asked me if I would be so kind as to extend it for one more video. And since they didn't even ask me to make a special plug or anything, I figured, what's the harm? Let's put it down in the description down below. And so, if you want to try out Raid Shadow Legends, or if you simply just want to support the channel, then please do head down there, click the link, finish the tutorial, and thank you all very much for your attention and your patience. Now, onto the video. You see, old Erebus has, never had a, confidence problem, to put it mildly, but as of late, he has gotten, overly ambitious. He has decided that the plans of the gods are not only things that he is in service to, he has come to the conclusion that he must help shape those plans. Otherwise, they simply just won't go quite right, you know? The ancient deities, the gods of chaos, they just didn't do their homework just right. Erebus needs to fine-tune their plans, and, of course, the fine-tuning has nothing to do with the fact that it'll all end up benefiting him in the end as well. No. He is obviously just seeking to better serve his immaterial masters, of course. And the first step in his enhanced servitude is the creation of 8 blades. Previously, there was just the anathema, the weapon that brought Horus Lupercal low and turned him from the Emperor and towards chaos. From that single blade, Erebus will hammer forth 8 shards, literally chipping pieces of the one true blade into 8 smaller blades. He would then take these back to Cadia, where the seeress who had helped him enter the dreams of Horus and turn him towards the purpose of the gods was waiting for him. Achu had foreseen the return of Erebus, despite, of course, she being the one who had sliced his throat as a part of the ritual. Erebus is not particularly happy with this part of the ritual because, well, strangely enough, she hadn't told him. Yeah, who could have imagined that twist, eh? But Erebus has plans beyond mere vengeance. He bows his head to the seeress and says that she has powers that he does not, and he begs her to teach him. She hesitates. I mean, I fucking would. I'd probably stab myself first. It's like, oh yes, I'm sure you'll be a good boy once I teach you my secret knowledge. Oh yes, indeed. She goes and has a communion with her gods, and they tell her, or well, we presume they are her gods anyways, to go ahead and teach Erebus whatever it is he wants to learn. And so she agrees. She takes Erebus on a lengthy journey across the plains of the planet and teaches him how to step through the warp and use the warp as a means of travel. She demonstrates this by teleporting herself a few dozen steps away. And she also erects fetid totems of beheaded skulls to allow Erebus to hone in on their lingering souls as a waymark within the warp. She teaches him to guard his mind, for whilst he is, of course, a true apostle of the Chaos Gods, that does not necessarily mean that he is perfectly safe from all of its denizens. Partially, this is due to the simple fact that many of the lesser and greater demons have plans and motivations all of their own, often somewhat separate from their patrons. And, of course, there are also entities in the warp that do not swear fealty to any of the 4 powers, who might relish the opportunity to pop into Erebus' skull and do all kinds of interesting things. Erebus is having a hard time learning the knack of this kind of travel, but eventually he starts mastering it, and soon he surpasses Achu in her mastery of the craft. He is able to not only teleport himself into space on the surface of a nearby moon, but is also able to locate a ship moving at speed within the warp and teleport aboard the ship into his own chambers. Once he had done that, he returns to Achu and informs her that he has learned everything he needs, and will now proceed to take his vengeance. He nails her to the floor using the 8 lesser anathems and starts skinning her alive, taking considerable pleasure in the act, and then devours her heart, allowing his Astartes physiology to absorb her memories as well, all of her knowledge. But he is disgusted to learn that apparently the seeress had a ace up her sleeve. She had been visited by a figure whose face Erebus cannot bring into clarity, regardless of how much of her flesh he devours. This figure had informed the seeress that this was her destiny, and that the gods wished it to be so. Erebus feels cheated. This was not the vengeance he had wanted, because, in fact, he had become nothing more than a vessel for the seeress to achieve ascendancy, to become a true sacrifice to the pantheon. But he had achieved, at the very least, his most base objective. He had learned how to travel the void, and he had created 8 blades with which this feat could be made both easier and indeed feasible in the first place. He proceeded to hand them out to 6 of the captains of the Word-Bearers Legion who were preparing their assault upon Calth. One he kept for himself, and another he gave to a mere sergeant. Amongst those who received it, of course, was Calth, who apparently Erebus and he are no longer quite as close as they once were. Erebus states that once they were co-conspirators, but these days they were far more in competition with one another, and not being able to resist the opportunity to brag, of course, Erebus delivers the blades by warp slipping into their chambers, into their midst, and sending them into pieces of metal, of rock, of ceramite and steel, and leaving a little note going, haha, look at me, look at the awesome shit I can do, fuck you very much, and inviting them all to a meeting, where he doesn't really explain how the blades work or anything, he just simply says, well, with these things you can do anything. You can corrupt individuals even. That is what catches Calth's eye. Oh my. Well, I suppose this is the explanation, isn't it, for why Calth's anathema was not able to make Guilliman fall. Because it was merely 1/8 of the blade that cut Horus. And even then, again, Horus was not converted by merely being wounded. That was just a part of a much greater scheme. Even if this sliver of the anathema possessed all the power of the true blade, it probably would still not have been enough to turn Guilliman. Kill him? Maybe. Indeed, even possibly. But turn him? Well, that was probably Calth's wishful thinking, and he then committed to this plan in an effort, I would presume, to catch up to Erebus. And so Erebus, in his infinite wisdom and scheming, became part of the reason why Guilliman did not die at Calth, and why the Ultramarines were able to cripple and trap the rest of the Word-Bearers' forces. Oh my, oh my. Who would have thought that mere self-interest would be such a destructive force? And now, I'm going to move on to the next short story, because the idea of splitting them up into individual videos I kind of like to begin with, but now that I'm looking at 8 different entries into this one book, I'm kind of like, okay, that's not really gonna work, is it? So I'll probably do like 2 or maybe 3 per to get a little bit more length on the video. So, next up is Graham McNeil's Calth That Was. This is a much longer story again, and reintroduces us to Ventanus, who of course we met last time we were on Calth. The planet has changed quite drastically since last time, and the surface is now de facto uninhabitable, to the point where even power-armored space marines can only operate above ground for limited periods of time. The only enhanced forces that could actually stay above ground with any degree of safety would be cataphracti-armed Terminators, but surprisingly, Ventanus does not have too many of those lying around, since most of his legionnaires undoubtedly would have been evacuated off surface to join with Guilliman, whereas those who remain stayed, well, partially through a desire for revenge to murder the last remaining Word-Bearers, and of course partially through necessity. After all, leaving the planet now would be too much of an admittance of defeat. Not to mention, killing the Word-Bearers is fun, of course. And the Word-Bearers really are in a world of hurt at the moment. Ventanus and his Ultramarines command most of the archaeologies, the huge underground civilian living complexes that allow much of the population to seek shelter, and also function as massive bastions for the surviving Ultramarines. Whereas the Wordbearers are, unfortunately for themselves, mostly relegated to above-ground structures and finding ways into the huge underground cavernous systems of Calth. Calth is apparently honeycombed by hundreds, if not thousands, of caverns, some of which are tiny, some of which are ginormous. Again, as mentioned, some of which actually houses the huge archaeology structures. And these caverns are not also fully mapped. Ventanus is engaged in a massive effort right now, in fact, to try and map out the cavern system of Calth so as to make sure that the Wordbearers can't, show up somewhere they were not expected to show up. Meanwhile, of course, he's also carrying out a war against the Wordbearers on the surface, and trying to figure out what kind of bolt holes they may have. The Ultramarines have full control over the orbital weapons grid, and that gives them a pretty damn significant advantage. One of the first things in the book is Ventanus carrying out an ambush against a fairly large formation of Wordbearers. He estimates around 500. He launches the ambush, harassing them with long-range firepower, and noticing that they are not able to fire back with any degree of efficiency, eventually realizing that they are practically out of ammunition. The Wordbearers swiftly begin to retreat in the only direction open to them, and Ventanus then opens a link to orbit, and a few seconds later, a big fat beam of las energy strikes the very area into which the Wordbearers were fleeing. In this engagement, we also get a very good little touch, I think, about the Ultramarines. Remember how last book I really did not like how Guilliman threw so many of his legionnaires to their death, trying to pass by a Furious Abyss and 2 Gloriana-class battleships, because that's just not what the Ultramarines do. In this book too, during this ambush, Ventanus notes that the enemy does indeed appear to be running low on ammunition, and both for his own part and for most of his Ultramarines, the urge to close with the enemy and finish them up close and personal with blades is almost overpowering. But the key word there is almost. Ventanus is an Ultramarine, and so he knows how to control his more baser urges, a lesson he apparently needs to teach to his Primarch these days. After the ambush, Ventanus returns to his archaeologies, and we get a little interesting view into everyday life. The Imperial Army is being used as checkpoint guards and security forces, in a way, although that will end up backfiring just a little bit later on when one of these checkpoints is overrun by traitors led by a Dark Apostle, one of the Chaos mages, I suppose, essentially, still present on the planet. Erebus himself, of course, as we know, has long since jumped ship because, well, he's not gonna stay in a losing fight, now is he? That would be downright silly. The Hand of Faith is far too important to be lost in such a minor sideshow thing. Indeed, as we learned in the first short story, he had even prepared to jump ship before the first shot had even been fired, suspecting that Lorgar might be looking for a way to get rid of Erebus. But there are still zealots amongst the Wordbearers left on the planet, one of which is arguing that it is really time to strike back against the Ultramarines. They may have won a victory, but the war for Calth is hardly over just yet. He states that the gods demand atrocities, and so assaults upon what remains of the civilian populace need to be carried out, and the Ultramarines must be brought the word of Lorgar. We then move on to another piece of interesting information before the atrocities begin. The Ultramarines have apparently become touchstones, symbols of hope to the local populace, and they will do things like reach out to touch their vambraces or give them offerings of a votive nature, like prayer vestments and so on. And of course they want to get a hold of their oaths of moments too, as almost sacred objects. This is very interesting that this is taking place on Calth, because of course the Ultramarines have a far... how do I put it? Closer relationship to their civilian populace than most legions. As mentioned, the Ultramarines recruit from every single planet in the 500 worlds. Anyone that lives there has the potential to become an Ultramarine by passing a series of extraordinarily harsh tests, but nevertheless there is a possibility. Though I assume the tests would probably be a little bit less insane during these days, since of course recruitment numbers would be far, far higher again. But, you know, extreme circumstance often leads to extreme change, and if your entire planet has been burned to a cinder, and you are now trapped forevermore in an underground arcology, with really no hope of ever returning to the surface in any meaningful form, I can see that inspiring some religiosity. I absolutely can. Though there is one particularly interesting instance where a woman touches one of the Ultramarines' vambrace and says, "She needs you to see," and hands him a small silver aquila. And when the Ultramarine asks who she is, the woman says, "The Saint." Very interesting. I mean, I know who she is probably referring to, but if it is that saint, then her powers have grown quite considerably since last time, hasn't it? Seeing as she's now... I had annoyed when Magnus did this, just casually communicated with Lorgar at the other side of the galaxy. This is kind of that, but far more limited, of course. I'm less annoyed, but apparently Euphrates now has the potential to... mind fuck civilians on the other side of the galaxy again. The moment the Ultramarine takes the small silver aquila, the woman seems shocked and confused as to why she's here and why she's standing in front of an Ultramarine, and simultaneously with this, targeting locks also blare to life across the Ultramarine's visor and locks onto an individual, pushing what appears to be a heavy cart of administrative material deeper within the archaeology. He immediately reacts and shoots the man as he throws his arms open and says, "Hear the word of Lorgar," but it is far too late. A nuclear device hidden in the cart detonates, wiping out the archaeology. 3 more archaeologies are also attacked simultaneously, resulting in over 2 million civilian casualties. Now, how the fuck a nuclear warhead made it past even the most basic of scans, I don't know. There is a mention of anti-scanning technology being used, but surely you would not just rely upon the scanning. You would check everything that went into these archaeologies, right? There's even mention of Imperial Army outposts guarding the entrances and thoroughly checking anything and everything that goes in. When Ventanus enters his archaeology, he goes through a lengthy cleaning and scrubbing procedure to remove any traces of radiation from his armor, and even the Ultramarines are checked, and yet they managed to smuggle it in? Well, I mean, on the other hand, these are massive archaeologies with tens of thousands of civilians pouring into them for refuge and shelter. I suppose getting a nuke past the security is not impossible, though I would certainly say unlikely. A smaller explosive device perhaps, but a nuke? Again, that requires a fair bit more in the way of easily detectable technology, not to mention the nuclear material itself, of course. But that was going to merely be the start of things. The Ultramarines obviously notice quite quickly that several of their archaeologies have disappeared in mushroom clouds. That is hardly the thing that escapes one's notice, and they begin plotting their revenge. They need to try and end the war as quickly as they can, and so they have pointed out one of their primary targets. Fodral Fel, one of the primary leaders of the invasion of Calth, has set up what appears to be a massive fortress in a manufactorum complex. This, then, will be the first proper goal of the Ultramarines' reclamation effort, and Aventanus leads his main forces towards this fortress. He will initiate the engagement with a massed bombardment from orbit, expected to annihilate as much of the enemy's defenses as possible, though resistance is, in all due likelihood, unavoidable, as Fodral Fel is expected to have dug himself and his wordbearers in deeply. And this is where something rather interesting happens. The Ultramarines arrive at the improvised fortress. They begin a brief engagement with the Chaos Cultist defenders before calling down the orbital strike, annihilating most, if not indeed all, of the fortress, which crumbles surprisingly easily, and also annihilates practically all of the heretical defenders. But no word-bearers were found amongst those defenders, only Chaos Cultists, despite the orbital scans showing the power packs of wordbearers, of Astartes, of superhuman warriors. And yet, when they advance into the ruins, they encounter no Astartes resistance, until finally coming across a central structure that has been up-armored far beyond the apparent walls or the fortress itself. It has withstood the bombardment. Very carefully, the Ultramarines move in, where they discover several thousand wordbearers, all impaled on black spears of iron. Now, this is interesting because it also describes later on as, in the middle of all of this, Fodral Fel is also impaled, and then they get back up again. They become reanimated with demonic spirits once the Ultramarines have been drawn into the trap. And the word-bearer demons then obviously throw themselves at the boys in blue, which begin fighting back immediately. They mention then specifically also that their armor was cold and unpowered, and yet the orbital scans had revealed the activity of Astartes' power packs. Whatever deceit has gone into the creation of this ambush has clearly been quite complex and perhaps even magical in nature. Sadly, the fight is kind of just interrupted, and we don't really know what happens with the fight, because we then move over to the perspective of Holbeloth and Carto, his dark apostle magician. Carto has convinced Holbeloth to come with him to the surface and witness a part of the galaxy's drama. He is referring to the orbital strike upon Fodral Fel's capital. He also then demonstrates to Holbeloth the ritual that takes place thereafter, and Carto then claims to have knowingly sacrificed Fodral Fel for a greater goal. How precisely Carto managed this, or got in contact with Fodral Fel, or arranged for the ritual, or set it up, or concealed it, or any of many questions that would naturally follow, well, we don't really get the answer to, unfortunately. However, with this massive atrocity, this massive ritual having been created, he is then able to infiltrate the mind of a member of the Ultramarine civilian entourage. He makes the man think that he is being pursued by demons, and the only escape is a clockwork statue of an angel that requires a specific code to open. And he sent this nightmare to the person several times over the course of preceding nights, which I thought was a very nice touch. It's just unfortunate that it is somewhat, undercooked, because honestly, this particular short story would probably have made a pretty damn good novel in and of itself if it had been properly expanded upon. It turns out that the Demons are not real. It is merely nightmares, but the Clockwork Angel is real. This person that has had his dreams fucked with is a member of the Mechanicus groups that have been mapping and sealing up the tunnel entrances. And now he runs towards one of these sealed tunnels and punches in a combination code to unseal it, which is all part of Carto the Dark Apostle's plan. Along with 6 elite Terminators and a Dreadnought, he then breaks through the now unsealed opening along with Hol Beloth. And in a case of, again, somewhat supreme dramatic convenience, both Hol Beloth and Carto then begin to undergo their transformation into demonic entities. It is suggested that Beloth is turning into something more akin to a spawn rather than a true demonic entity, whereas Carto seems to be going the correct way, the opposite direction from spawndom, and is having his own powers increased as well. And the reason given for this is that he is about to unleash quite the devastation upon Archaeology X. For you see, Carto has stolen a canister of the Life Eater virus, which he is now preparing to detonate within the primary archaeology, whilst the Ultramarines are away dealing with Forel Fell's fortress. However, before he is able to detonate it, Ventanus shows back up again, some goddamn how, and grabs the canister from Carto, who then steps back and opens a rift in the warp and escapes through it. Ventanus, thinking quickly, then takes the canister of the Life Eater virus and chucks it into the warp rift after Cartho, which I gotta admit was a good idea. Very good idea, in fact. And so, the archaeology is saved, and Calth is rescued from another massive disaster. I mean, again, this story honestly could have been a full-on novel, because I think there was enough intrigue here. In fact, the shortness of the story really does a massive disservice to the intrigue, because it all comes across as very contrived. Like, okay, so Forel Fell chooses to sacrifice himself and all of his word-bearers to be infested by demonic entities, right? And Cartho was the one who apparently egged them on to do this, or at the very least knew that was the plan. Okay, that sounds a little bit far-fetched. And then he knows of a secret passage into Archaeology X, which, I mean, okay, I could see him figuring that one out as well, through scrying or something, and then he locates the individual who can disengage the lock and sends him nightmares, which again is a really cool touch, but it's like, just, okay, when did he do all of this? When did all of this nonsense actually happen? And at several points whilst reading the short story, I completely lost track of things, and I was like, wait, they're here now? Wait, how did they get there? No, hold on, weren't they over there? But, oh, Ventanus is here now? But he was over there, and it's like, it really could have benefited from a bit more in the way of story. This is one of those short stories that really just doesn't work as a short story, but it probably would actually have been pretty good as a full-on novel, I think. Anywho, moving on, we are now going to be talking about Dark Heart from Anthony Reynolds. And right off the bat, we get a rather intriguing revelation. The name of the novel, Dark Heart, is in reference to a secret cabal operated by Corferon, Lorgar's adoptive father. And apparently, this is a secret cabal that he has been operating for his own aims and goals since before Lorgar even came to Colchis. And now, with Calth, they serve him even in opposition to Lorgar. Very interesting. Corferon's roots of betrayal sink even more deeply than anyone could have anticipated, it appears. How far ahead in time has he planned, I wonder? How much did the Pantheon tell him, or at least convince him that they have told him to steer all of this. Of course, the Corpheron, as we find him right now at Calth, is entirely convinced that he is the chosen one of the Pantheon, and that Lorgar is a mere upstart pup, though part of that prejudice is also fueled by fear that Lorgar might be far more, and that maybe the Pantheon has been lying to Corpheron about his value for a very long time. But right now, Corpheron has a more immediate concern. You see, the assault upon the orbital defense platforms above Calth did not go quite without a hitch. One of the younger acolytes decided to murder his master in the midst of the assault upon the defense platforms. That young acolyte has now been brought before Corpheron, partially so that Corpheron may render judgment, and partially so Corpheron can try and figure out how the hell he did it. And this is where things get interesting. Apparently, there is a pretty damn severe disconnect within the Word-Bearers Legion. There are many who believe that possession by demonic entities is an honor. It is something to only be granted to those of true faith. It is a very prestigious thing. However, there are others, as is the case with our young acolyte Marduk, who is of the opinion that the Neverborn should be used as weapons. They should be allowed and facilitated to possess the bodies of their enemies, so that they may fight alongside them. It is... Again, I can definitely see it. I can absolutely see the rationale for the Word-Bearers to view this as a sacred, holy thing, and that is, of course, why they created the Gal Vorbak, and why they also revere them to the extent that they currently do. Although, as Argal Tal told us in the latest book, or the last book, Betrayer, he thinks that the recent crop of Gal Vorbak are not true Gal Vorbak. They are mere imitations of Argal Tal and his original 100, because they saw the truth for themselves. And, well, they were also sacrificed to the truth, personally, by Lorgar. However, the Neverborn, the creatures of the Immaterium, clearly side with the latter interpretation, as a creature speaks to Marduk. Marduk is very unsatisfied with the level of tutelage that he is receiving at the hands of Bel Ashered. His mentor was supposed to be, well, just that, a mentor. He was supposed to be someone to teach Marduk how to eventually become an acolyte, a priest of the word of Lorgar. But, sadly, Bel was not very good at what he was supposed to be doing. He did not know a great deal about the warp, and he had no intuitive connection to it, and certainly much less of one than Marduk had. And so he figured that there might be a good time to put in place a bit of an insurance policy in case his mentor became too jealous. Marduk called upon one of the entities in the warp and taught him a inscription. He worked upon the helmet of Bel Ashered, presumably as a menial duty or something to that effect, I'd suppose, and inscribed within it 1,000 upon 1,000 curses. How Bel Ashered never noticed when he put the helmet on again, because apparently before that the surface was uninscribed, I don't really no, honestly. Maybe he had given Marduk the task of inscribing holy sigils on the inside of it, but then again, was he really so stunted as to not be able to tell the difference between holy and cursed sigils? It's possible, I guess. It's just... It's a clever trick. I like it. The trick is basically, okay, he's inscribed all of this, and all that is required for this to kill his mentor is the speaking of a trigger word. And as Marduk carries out an unholy ritual on an ultramarine unsanctioned, Bel Ashered orders for him to be seized, and orders his immediate execution for sullying this sacred unity. He is not trying to put a demon within a willing host, a blessing. He is instead trying to force it upon a heretic, an unwilling soul. At which point Marduk speaks the code phrase whispered to him by the demon, and Ashred is turned inside out by all of the curses. Again, I mean, it's very clever. I like it. It's a cool idea. You know, this is a trap in the dude's helmet, a demonic thing that unleashes a warp entity. It's cool, but just really, he didn't notice or he didn't know? I mean, yes, the story goes to great lengths to explain to us that Bel Ashred was stunted in the ways of the warp, but was he that ignorant? Huh. I suppose the answer is an unequivocal yes. Oh well. Corferon, of course, quite likes this. Clearly, this Marduk has some skill in the manipulation of the warp, and so he forgives him. Indeed, he even takes him as an acolyte and informs him about his plans to try and turn Gilliman, which, yeah, that didn't really work out all that well, did it? But, hey, yeah. Nevertheless, it is a story that is not necessarily overly important, but it does give us a look into the opinions of the word bearers, how they viewed the possession as a sacred thing and not something to be forced upon the unwilling, because, well, it's I guess it would kind of be like possessing an infidel with an angel. A murderous, bloodthirsty, violent angel that lives only to torture the living, but, you know, semantics, I do suppose. So with a relatively short one under our belts, we shall move on to The Traveller by David Annandale. There's not a whole lot of lore importance in this one, but it is a cool story, if nothing else. It is talking about one survivor of an orbital weapons platform that should have been dead, that arrives in an archaeology. He is rescued, but the archaeology's entrance collapses, trapping all those inside and forcing them to desperately dig for the surface, despite all hope seeming to be lost. They simply just do not have enough food for the hundreds of people stuck inside, and they certainly don't have anywhere near the amount of medical supplies required to treat all of those injured in the collapse and, of course, in the dangerous journey towards the surface again. Our lone survivor then begins hearing voices, whispers of a horrible nature, talking about claws and blood and tearing and guts and, you know, all of the usual chaosy stuff. To protect his own fragile psyche, he convinces himself that he's not hearing things. Instead, someone else is whispering these things to him. Someone out there is a meanie old grumpy puss and is trying to make his fragile little mind go breaky. And, I mean, that does make a degree of sense, certainly. He eventually figures out that he knows who is doing this. It is one specific individual. He tries to tell the local army commander about this, but he just dismisses him as a crazy person and moves on. But then he gets a vision of bombs, of explosives going off, and then things go boom. Suddenly, he don't seem so crazy no more now, does he? Apparently, the bombs were set by a crazed medical person who, who presumably, after working for uncounted hours trying to save people, realized this is fucking pointless and just goes like, okay, well, death is a mercy at this point. Boom, boom, motherfuckers. A bit of a hasty decision, seemingly, but hey, you know, stress does weird things to people. And then our hero points out the person he believes to have helped the doctor and names him Heretic. Oh my. He has at this point convinced himself that this is a gift given to him by the God Emperor because he is a faithful of the, and I always get this, Lectio Divinitatis, who cares? You know, the book that Lorgar wrote and then, you know, doesn't like being reminded of anymore. There was even a point in, I think, Betrayer, where Lorgar is like, oh my, look at this future, for example. This future is crazy. In this future, people worship the Emperor. What kind of an insane hellhole is this? Yeah, Lorgar. Yeah. I wonder which future that is. Anywho, our hero, quote-unquote, now figures that he has the ability to spot traitors, depending upon the whispering noises, and carries out a mass purge of the archaeology alongside one of the surviving Imperial Army personnel. It turns out that he's not actually hearing the God Emperor whispering to him. Instead, a demon has apparently infected his voice somehow. I don't really know how, but he had apparently spoken over the Vox to a word-bearer's ship, and that had transmitted a demon into this person. And only much later, once, his mind breaks completely, does he let the demon get control over his body, at which point, of course, it's all donezo, and the demon continues to murder all of the population in the underground archaeology. Several days thereafter, a rescue party managed to dig their way in and finds this lone survivor. Now, apparently, the demon's powers have grown significantly because no longer can it merely transfer itself via speech. Now it can actually outright infect people straight up and take control over them just like that, which seems like a bit of a plot convenience, but oh well. It's a decent story. The twist is too goddamn obvious because the person it picks out is like, he's described like, he's malformed, he's hunched, he's ugly looking, and immediately at that point I'm like, so he's the good guy, isn't he? And yes, indeed he is, and he tries to kill our little crazy person at the end, but fails due to, well, demonic possession. Decent twist, an oldie but a goldie. There's a reason why the cliches are cliches, but it was too darn telegraphed, this one, I think. It's just... I feel like a teacher grading like an essay here. I'd give this one a 4 out of 10, because again, if the plot had been a little bit more obfuscated and had come as a bit more of a like, oh god, really? That would have been way better, but it's telegraphed too dang much. I guess he couldn't have really have all that much time to build it up either. This is a short story, but, when you describe the guy who supposedly whispers to you as a malformed hunchback of Notre Dame, anyone who has read any book ever will very quickly go, I see. So, when are you going to turn crazy then? And indeed, there we are. The whole demon transmitting via voice thing, I mean, I haven't heard of any demon doing that before, but hey, it's the warp. It does fucking nonsense, so I'm certainly not going to say that that's an impossibility. And that was the 4th out of 8 stories, so although it's a little on the short side, I think this seems like an excellent place to wrap up the first video, and then we'll see if we can't get the other 4 into one second part. That sounds downright reasonable, in fact. Till next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.